you hover it that just.
Good morning or afternoon, whenever you're listening to this broadcast or webinar. My name is Sarah Hyland. I work for the AIFST. This is the third of three insights pieces that I'm doing for the GLNC. And this one is about fad diets. Where to start? There's a lot of things to say about fad diets, but I've broken it up into 5 sections for our talk today. I'll talk a little bit about what is a fad, what's generally regarded as fadistic behaviour around food. I'm going to do a trends roundup of all the eating patterns and eating styles, some of which may be described as fadistic and others which may not. We'll talk a little bit about some realities about nutrition in Australia as well, touch on some other voices and things that other people are saying, and draw it into a conclusion at the end. So first of all, what is a fad? I think we generally know what a fad is, but many dietitians and centres of nutrition, for which that is their expertise, would similarly summarise it in this way. So it's pretty easy to spot them. You know, a fad shares some or all of the following characteristics, and one of the main ones is that you're going to get results real quick. And how? Because of a magical food or combination of foods that's a secret that no one will tell you, but I will, that will get your results very quickly with, you know, minimum effort. It won't actually be that hard. Also, there's often promises around changing the nature of your body or the way your body responds to things in a new way. Inevitably, it's about exclusion or restriction of some food group or nutrient that could be described as the devil's work that nobody knows about except this individual who's willing to share the information with you. Very rigid in rules and claims based on not very much evidence, quite frankly. Some of them can cause terrible health problems, certainly if they're adhered to for very long periods of time. So without a doubt, dehydration, weakness and fatigue, nausea and headaches, constipation, which is associated with a lot of these kinds of diets, and certainly longer term there's danger around nutrition in terms of vitamin and mineral intake. So they often lead to weight loss at first. Most of this is all about weight loss. So you feel you're getting results, but most of it's water and lean muscle rather than the fat, which is what we're really wanting to reduce, because when we eat, our body begins to break down the muscle. When we eat very little, when we're on a very restricted diet, and that occurs more easily than the breakdown of fat stores when we get to very low calorie diets. So that leads to water loss and, more disturbingly, reduced metabolic rate. So your fat burners or your burners in your body tend to turn down to low because your body's thinking, oh, we're in starvation mode. We've got to really conserve our energy here. Let's reduce our burning. So it's much easier to have an increase in weight over time. So as a result, that's exactly what happens. You can diet yourself fat. I think we've all been there. So, as I said, short-term eating behaviour rather than anything long-term. And a lot of the narrative is around, you can do it, it's only for 10 days or it's only for 30 days. You can do anything for 30 days. But that's kind of not the message of science and the message of reputable groups talking about health and weight loss. Boston University School of Medicine have done a bit of work on this, and they estimate 98% of people who lose weight regain it within 5 years. So that is why, you know, the diet industry is doing so well and is in growth in all different areas. But many diets fail to produce weight loss because, let's face it, after 30 days of doing this or 10 days of doing that, you want to get back to your habits and the things that make you feel good in the moment. So the fad is not sustainable. There's also a lot in the psychology. I'm going to touch on that a little bit about deprivation and where that leads you in terms of binge eating and poor decisions around food. Because it's fun, I'm going to, like, how could I not take the opportunity to look at some real crazy juice kind of diets that are out there. And, you know, one of them is this cabbage soup diet. And yes, it became famous after Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. The novel was turned into a film in the 1960s, and you might remember that the Bucket family was so poor, all they had to eat was cabbage soup, right? So someone thought, oh, that sounds like a good idea for a diet. So, and this is a fad. This is saying short term. It's not suitable for long term. It's low fat, high fibre, get you into shape fast. You know, you'll lose weight really quickly. You might find it tastes horrible, El Blando life for 7 days. Others report feeling lightheaded, weak, and suffering from decreased concentration, but it's totally worth it since you lose so much weight. And this last thing, I laughed out loud. It's not this. So it's sometimes referred to as the Mayo Clinic diet, the Sacred Heart Hospital diet, and many other names. Interestingly, this diet is not affiliated with either of these places, which are reputable. Oddly enough, they decided to put that on the website. That's a quick one. This is one that's been around for a while. It's making a little bit of a resurgence, is the Sleeping Beauty diet. What's that? Well, that's when you sleep instead of eat. And Elvis was a fan. I think we know a little bit about Elvis and his issues around food and weight and health in the longer term. But basically what it's saying is you spend more time asleep than awake, then you'll eat less. And so, you know, predictably enough, you need to take some medication to allow this to happen. But, you know, it's out there. Now, this is Beyonce. She likes the Master Cleanse. She lost 15 kilos on the Master Cleanse diet. And all you have is a bit of cayenne pepper with lemon juice, washed down with a maple syrup chaser. It's pretty much all you survive on for the most part. But the highlight of the day is the laxatives that you take before bed. So exactly, that'll sort you right out. So there she is, looking hot. So why wouldn't you do the Master Cleanse? Okay, so there's some sort of stuff that's around at the moment that I would absolutely describe as a fad. It was very difficult for me to not talk about the Minnesota starvation experiment when we talk about fad diets, because any diet regime that is extreme in nature leaves people with very similar issues to what is described and what has been articulated and recorded in this very famous Minnesota starvation experiment. And I actually read about it. I've never studied nutrition or dietetics. Oddly enough, I read about it in a feminist book, The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf, and I read it, would be 25 years ago, when I was a bit more of an angry young woman, I suppose. And anyway, it was very interesting to read about. So I wanted to talk about it today. So the Minnesota starvation experiment, at the end of World War II, there are a bunch of starved refugees and American prisoners of war that began coming into the United States. And Ansel Keys, a most famous doctor of nutrition at the University of Minnesota, you can read about him, there's a lot written about Ansel Keys, was tasked with evaluating how the human body responded to food deprivation, not just from a physical point of view, but from an emotional point of view. But I think the emotional stuff actually cropped up as something to observe rather than it being looked at as an important thing in the immediate sense. So 36 men volunteered on this 13-month study, so that's quite a commitment. They were mostly soldiers. Now, the interesting thing about them is that they were all screened for having good relationships with food. So natural eating patterns, normal healthy weight, like they were all, none of them had any major issues with food or a history of unusual eating habits. They were all pretty standard, healthy kind of guys. So the first 12 weeks was pretty sweet, 3,200 calories a day, it was all great. But then for 6 months, which is a long time, they were brought down to 1,600 a day, which is pretty low. Predictably, they became drained and fatigued without food, as you would, low levels of nutrition and energy there. But the interesting thing was the change in behaviour, and the power of hunger to spark anger was both fascinating and disturbing. according to Ansel Keys. So lots of examples, but always around food. So cafeteria lines to get food became volatile places where they'd start having fist fights. They became very irrationally annoyed with each other, whereas in the first 12 weeks, they actually got on quite well, quite good camaraderie. But then other behaviours. Plate licking. Really finding ways to extend mealtime and to get that satiety. Dilute potatoes with water, so an extending their food. Holding bites of food in their mouths for a really long time without swallowing to really savour that experience, not wolfing it down, or laboured over combining the food on their plate, like what am I going to have with this and this fork for? What sort of texture and taste is it going to deliver? The interesting thing was, this is a quote from his report, they would coddle the food like a baby or handle it and look at it as they would some gold. And now these are guys without any issues with food before they came into this experiment. And then over time, it was just bloody plain obsession. All they could think about was food. All of their other interests evaporated. They would plot ways to steal food from each other. They'd all take up smoking, well, they're already smokers because it's 1944, but more smoking. So they're allowed to have any number of cigarettes and any number of gum, amount of gum to get these hunger pangs away. Being interested in everything that they enjoyed. So all their hobbies, social interests, all budding romances were bloody put on hold because all they wanted to think about was food. And so, you know, pin-ups, Betty Grable there, that's pretty racy back in the day. Well, they took down their Betty Grable and they became obsessed about collecting recipes. Recipes, pictures of food, what am I going to eat? Or if I could cook and eat anything I wanted, what would it be? And that was the sole thread of their existence during this starvation time. But then they had food reintroduced and they became even more obsessed with the food once it came back. They kept up the plate licking habit. They were more emotionally irritable and even more aggressive now food was back. So from a mental point of view, they were still very much in this obsessive zone. And then from a physical point of view, their bodies could barely handle it. They couldn't stomach the food well. But they just went on violent binges that ended up, often they'd have to go to hospital and be managed. Many became overweight because their natural eating ability had pretty much been quashed and they struggled to regain their natural eating pattern. Some took years. Some took 2 to 5 years to get their natural eating habits back on track. So, you know, some important conclusions. Food restriction affects the mind and the body. And I think one of the things that we know about starvation is that it is one of the most painful ways to die. Your body really responds in such aggressive ways when it's deprived of its basic need of food. And people's reactions, whether it's purposeful or as a consequence of war, can transform their characters. There was no underlying source or motivation for deprivation. They weren't doing it, you know, to achieve anything. They'd signed up to this program in the name of the US government or peace or however it was pitched to them. There wasn't really anything in it for themselves in this particular study. So in many ways, and you know, they were so well managed in other ways, they were starving under the best possible conditions. They didn't want for anything else. It was just the food that was the reduced. They had good health care and all of those kinds of things. Deprivation drove these to the threshold of insanity. You know, men who were otherwise stable and happy in many other ways, well adjusted. So these known drawbacks, so you can't sustain bad diets and severe restriction, you know, and the inevitable weight gain. I think it's been very well articulated in recent times in the media. Diets don't work, you know. Quick fix, this messaging has been adopted by health and wellness gurus as well as trained dietitians. So I think there's been an evolution from fad to picking up a lot of these sadistic principles and saying, well, actually, you know what? This restriction and deprivation and removal of certain food groups, actually, yeah, you can do it for life. So there's not a lot talking about quick fix for weight loss, but more suggesting this is a total change of lifestyle, an adoption of a pattern or set of habits that will ensure that, you know, your changes and benefits will be weight loss, but then everything else as well. All of the other huge benefits that you and your family are going to have from joining my tribe, right, and becoming in my group and on my page. This is going to be your life now. All right. Let's talk about trends then in eating patterns, because that's where the movement is. So who was dieting? So I pulled some data from the Australian Health Survey. This is from 2011-2012, which is the most recent one. And so over 2.3 million Australians over 15 are reported they're on a diet for weight loss or another health reason. 2/3 of people who reported being on a diet were to lose weight, and 4% were on a diet for other health reasons. About half of the people on the diet describe the type of diet as weight loss or low calorie, with a high proportion of female dieters being on weight loss compared with men, as we might imagine. But then let's think about fads. So the Dietitians Association of Australia did a survey, pretty respectable survey with 1,000 Australians. 18 to 34s, probably not surprising, are more likely to have experimented with fad diets, with about nearly 2/3 having tried a certain diet in the last 12 months. So that's where the fads are coming. They're more likely to be jumping on these dodgy diets than anyone else. Let's talk a little bit about paleo. I don't want to labour paleo. You could do a whole presentation about it, but I just want to say quickly what it is and what it isn't. So it's vegetables, it's fruit, it's eggs. It's, you know, thank goodness that elk is on the menu there. I don't think I could participate in that diet unless there was more wild meat. So fish and nuts is fine, but clearly not. Are things that we shouldn't be eating too much of anyway, which is all the discretionary foods. But sadly, we know that grains and dairy are off the menu. So, you know, but it is what it is. AIFST did some food chat work about a year ago, and they did some interesting surveying with a couple of thousand respondents, and they looked at a number of different trends. And the paleo diet had really high awareness, very high awareness, like 45% of those surveys were aware of it, but, you know, probably only, 3% have really tried it. So you can, I think some people have a go at it or they do it in parts of their lives, but to adopt it fully is an issue. And I think most of the things that I'm reading now about paleo is about how unsustainable it is. This is a quote from a piece from a journalist in New Zealand, and she had her family on paleo for 5 days. Now, this quote here, I think, captures a lot of everything that I've read about feedback from paleo diet. So this is what she said. Living paleo for just 5 days was tough. It was exy, time-consuming, and totally unsatisfying. He says they're quick and easy when you don't have 3 little kids to look after, a million trips to the supermarket to make, and all sorts of weird ingredients. But for us mere mortals, it takes a lot of mucking around. There wasn't a single meal that I didn't think could be made better by nice bread, pasta or rice. The kids hated it, my husband hated it, and I'll probably never be able to eat red meat again without being a bit sick. The diet that cave folk probably ate, well, maybe, but they also died really, really young, and I bet if they had access to a nice fresh steamed bowl of pasta, they'd toss their woolly man apart to one side and tuck into the cup. So it's quite a nice quote, and I think sums it up rather nicely. And look, that's just unsustainable and unfun, but we're seeing so much more now in the press, thank goodness, about it not just being unsustainable, but dangerous. It's an unsafe way of living. And as I was talking before about fads, some are, pick it up for 10 days. This is joining the tribe. This is, signing up to the program for life, from birth to death. This is a cradle to grave prospect. And this in itself is alarming. You would have seen the piece, perhaps, I think it was in the Australian, not long ago, with Carolyn Overington really putting together a nice piece around his interview that he had recently, but also the fact that he just totally dismisses science as a throwaway line. And a really nice piece just recently, last week, about Pete Evans and the rejection of science. And I'd suggest you read that one. That's a good one in the Saturday paper. And this was a good quote from that. Martin Mackenzie Murray wrote, "A cliche in our language is healthy scepticism, a scepticism that's supple, moderate." And he's drawing some parallels between Pete Evans and Donald Trump. What Evans and Trump supporters possess is unhealthy. It's an antisocial scepticism, a roiling, conspirational kind that sees folly and corruption everywhere. So, you know, there is a good measure of questioning around Pete Evans, around, I think, his ability to look at logic, around his ability to, you know, understand compelling evidence and be open-minded in his approach. Because I think what we all know about Pete Evans and his Facebook page is if you say things he doesn't like, well, guess what? You're out of the tribe. That's cultish behaviour. Anyway, let's move on. I could go on and on. Gluten-free. Okay, so that came on board a good 5 years ago and everyone was saying that was a fad. And I felt it had a room to run, and I think it is in some ways, but I would say, like most things, it's for a segment but not for everyone. The thing that I've said before about gluten-free is that food technology and food science has adapted well to it, in that there are many, many foods whereby you can deliver a gluten-free product offering without issues around palatability. But there is one area where it's still proving difficult, and that's bread. And that's where gluten, you know, has a fundamental physical role to play in terms of texture delivery. So Nielsen ran a survey on healthy eating last year and showed that 21% of consumers around the world ate gluten-free diets, including, you can see the numbers there, 30% in Latin America, 28% in the Middle East, and 20% in the Asia Pacific. And those numbers resonate. They're about right with other surveys that I've seen. The survey showed some were not only turning away from gluten, but were prepared to pay an average of 23% more for doing so. So there's a segment there who will go for it. And whilst the food is palatable and they feel good about it, they'll do it. Conversely, Cyclone Debbie, here in Queensland just last week, and the devastating effects that it's had. This was posted just before the cyclone on Twitter, which I thought was kind of funny. Cyclone still isn't bad enough to risk gluten-free bread. So everyone's stocking up on food, you know, ready to shut themselves in for the cyclone, but yet here's gluten-free bread still kind of sitting there, not being grabbed. It's a risk in terms of palatability. There was a really interesting study, GRDC study, that was done and released earlier this year, preliminary exploration of non-celiac gluten avoidance behaviour in Australia. So I'm talking about non-celiacs here. And we know celiacs are 1% of the population or thereabouts. So thinking a little bit about the prevalence of non-celiac gluten avoidance, this particular study seems to suggest it's plateaued at a rate of 20%, which is in line with our Nielsen work. This is for Australia. So it's probably reached its critical mass until bread improves in terms of palatability, gluten-free bread. So gluten avoiders have been found to avoid more of anything food-related. So they experience negative symptoms more frequently, both after food consumption and in general, and perceive food-related risks as more serious. So they're talking about segments. This is a segment in itself, an attitudinal segment, a response segment around food. There are inherent psychological differences that appear to be involved in gluten avoidance, and therefore unlikely there will be significant increases in future prevalence rates, which I thought was an interesting conclusion, and that's the funny place comic there. All right, and as we know, Gluten-free diet could be linked to type 2 diabetes, came up in the press just a month ago, and out of Harvard, out of a reputable, respectable place. And the GLNC was certainly featured in a report in The Australian not long ago about this. So, there is a few things that are starting to suggest that, this one's plateauing a little bit in terms of a fad or a trend or a way of eating. Now, in terms of low carb, this is something that's come out recently. This is the dopamine diet. This fella, Tom Kerridge, is a British chef, and he lost something phenomenal, like 70 kilos, like a person, an average person's weight. It took him 3 years, but he followed this principle. And I think this is a bit fadistic because I think the science is still a bit out here. It's a bit of a stretch. So dopamine, it's a neurotransmitter, so it's a chemical, it's a feel-good chemical that's responsible for transmitting signals between nerve cells in the brain. It directly affects the reward and pleasure centres, which in turn affects mood. There is emerging evidence, I couldn't find where from, to show that people who are overweight may have impairments in dopamine pathways, which could have been blunted through constant exposure to highly sugary and fat foods. So the blunted response could lead to increased reward-seeking behaviour, i.e. eating more food. But we do know that all eating increases dopamine, especially high fat and high sugar, which leads to increase in appetite, overeating and weight terms. So the idea of this is, how do you boost your dopamine without having unhealthy food? Well, the answer is protein. Protein foods. Using protein intake may also boost dopamine without increasing appetite. So it's an egg-heavy, lean meat-heavy, dairy-heavy kind of diet that's very, very low in carbs. So it's a low-carb diet, but using a different vehicle than the one that we usually hear about what carbohydrates do. This is taking more a brain chemistry point of view. Another diet, and this is a short one, not a lifestyle one, is the Whole30. And it makes some big claims, and I mean big. Change your life in 30 days. It's like a reset button. It's like the computer person in the company, the computer guy saying, just shut everything down and start it up again and it'll work. That's pretty much what this is, a nutrition reset to put an end to unhealthy cravings and habits, restore your metabolism, also heal your digestive tract and balance your immune system. So it's picking up on some of those sadistic clues around changing your biochemistry of your body a bit and sorting out your mind. Change the way you think about food, change your tastes, change your habits and cravings, and change the emotional relationship you have with food. And it probably will, but maybe not in a good way. So you can eat meat, seafood, eggs, but you can't have grains, dairy, legumes, any sugar, and you can't have booze. And honestly, the things it will solve, the problems it will solve is unbelievable. So your standard garden variety health issues, so high blood pressure, high cholesterol, any kind of diabetes. Then it's down here about endometriosis and bipolar disorder and sort out my Crohn's and my leaky gut. That's probably a talk on its own, leaky gut. ADD really is going to be sorted out by this. So it's a lot of big promises, but it's definitely an emerging one for this year. So you'll probably hear more about it. Don't know any celebrities who are on it yet, but I'm sure I can find out. Okay, the 5-2 fasting, and I think this is a really interesting one because this fasting has come to light recently, and I think you can't pick up a prevention or a women's health magazine without giving you, 200-calorie meal ideas. It's the uptake, I think, on this is pretty good. A doctor did it, right? So we got a bit of cred there. Michael Mosley, and he's been on, a number of different shows about a number of different things. He's a fairly well-regarded sort of media doctor. And how do you do it? Well, you have 5 days of normal eating and then 2 days of 500-calorie eating. And there's 2 books, Liz, that are both around losing the last 5 kilos. I can't remember what the titles of each of them are. Michelle Bridges does one and Susie Burrell does one. And in these books, both of them do advocate 1 day a week of really low calorie eating, particularly low in carbohydrates, to sort of help push things along. But that's like once a week for 4 weeks to shift your last 5 kilos. This is pretty much saying, you know, until you lose the 30 kilos, until you lose the 50 kilos. But you know, the trouble is it's a bit unbalanced. It doesn't tap into natural hunger cues. It's a bit of, you know, up and down, feasting, fasting. It's almost like the Minnesota experiment, but except done over 12 weeks and 26 weeks. It's done over a week, and it's unsustainable in the long term. A lot of the advice is eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, trust your appetite, feed your body, not your emotions, be active and respect yourself. Whereas this kind of diet is stretching those natural hunger cues, forcing you to do things that perhaps your body's not really ready to respond to. But, you know, it's fasting and it's fast. So it's a great word for anything fad. The other one is anti-inflammatory, and I find this a very fascinating one, and Giselle Bundchen, the Argentinian model, is totally into this one. And I think there is some science around this particular diet, around inflammation, different levels of inflammation. But the point is that this anti-inflammatory diet involves eating natural unrefined foods that don't inflame the gut. So supporting everything from a balanced microbiome, strong bones, and helping fight cancer. It's not only proven to be powerful medically, but mimics much of the same, you know, clean eating philosophy of the whole clean eating movement. Now, Giselle there in her underwear avoids sweet potato, eggplant, tomatoes, potato, and capsicum. Those particular kinds of vegetables are meant to really be quite inflammatory. But Jo McMillan, I saw an interview with her about this, and she said, yeah, you probably don't need to avoid those sorts of foods for this particular diet. And I think, you know, for the most part, anti-inflammatory and what you can eat and what you can't eat makes a lot of sense generally. But the reasons are around keeping well, like an overall wellness piece. And according to the Herald, about 6 weeks ago, it's the next big thing. All right, so I also did want to talk about other possible motivations for joining these sorts of ways of living or ways of eating. Talked a bit about paleo. I just didn't want to give Sarah Wilson more airtime with the sugar-free, but that's another lifestyle diet or way of living. So a lot of this is all around weight losses, as we've seen, and looking good, feeling good. But I think there's something else going on here as well, and that is food as religion and as a symbol of spirit. So thinking about the human condition and human motivations, one thing that we do know is that participation in formal organised religions has been in the decline for a very long time. So fewer people are participating in these sort of traditional churches and traditional communities. So that tends to suggest that there's a bit of a gap in terms of a sense of belonging for people. So, you know, we're less community, we're less involved in a broader community. There are more people than ever living alone or living in small households. Everybody's got earphones on, looking at their phones, absorbed in independent activities. So there is a theory, David Tacey and David Chalk, some work done actually down at La Trobe. It's very, very, very interesting, theorising that where food becomes an actual religion, provides a sense of belonging to a dietary movement. So instead of being Roman Catholic, you're a vegan or a paleo, you know, and the people heading these dietary movements are giving, you know, like the Messiah, you know, the people who are involved in sugar-free or Paleolithic, their leaders are really important to them. They're the head of that movement, and we should try and emulate the way they live. Because look at the great success they've had. Look at how adopting this way of life has saved them. And both and Sarah Wilson have stories about that. They used to be like this, then they believed and practiced, and they were saved. So there are parallels there. So they talk. So it's a social piece. Massive decline and splintering of traditional belief systems being offset by the ability of individuals to self-curate your own religion, courtesy of the smartphone and the internet. Food's become a fetish. All of these food cults have their own language of inclusion and exclusion. It's not enough to belong. It's about feeling special because you belong and the heathens don't. And I follow this hilarious Twitter feed, Paleo Pete Evans, which isn't really him at all. And someone's written there, I really wish you had halal meals. And he said, well, sorry, religion didn't exist in Paleolithic times except for the paleo diet religion, obviously. So there you go. And let's go and eat. But I've got to post this on my wall, my cave paintings there. It's a really interesting piece, and one of the other reasons why we want to belong. All right, let's talk about other more pressing matters in many ways. And whilst we have everyone on a diet, not everyone, well, we have people on a diet and the uptake of these sorts of ways of eating, there are some fundamental and foundational issues still with us with nutrition in Australia. So this is just this week, Aussies fail on Thyro Nutrition Report Card, getting a fail on the fruit and vegetable front. And Manny Noakes has come, she's done a piece, which you can see, about how poor our fruit and vegetable eating habits are. This was good. The DAA survey found that nearly half of us tried to lose weight via a diet in the past year. The $635 million we spend will be better spent stocking up on fresh food. Social issues. Life in and outer suburbs make its dwellers more obese than inner city slickers. So your postcode, your distance from a major city is correlated with the level of obesity that you might be experiencing. And I nearly died when I saw this in the news about scurvy reappearing in Sydney. It was all over the press, particularly amongst people with diabetes, because they reduced their fruit intake to avoid high blood sugar. So there's a group who are already struggling and having challenges with their diet and their health, extending themselves to scurvy. So this tends to, suggest to me the effort and the voice that's given to these sorts of extreme diets is imbalanced. In terms of consumers, it's segments, okay? We understand around segmentation. Consumers are not all the same. And the concern is that we're not paying attention to these different kinds of segments. An interesting piece from Brunel University in London was found that healthy eating campaigns and healthy eating advertisements and pieces of education, well, it's only people who are dieting who are responsive to these. So when you think about, the whole model of the human condition and behaviour change, only a certain group are really responsive to a lot of this sort of education. So most people choose unhealthy snacks that are high in salt, fat and sugar, regardless of whether they've watched adverts for healthy food or unhealthy food, and only dieters choose the healthy snack. The majority of unrestrained eaters preferentially chose an unhealthy snack, irrespective of the advertisement they'd seen, whereas highly restrained eaters who'd seen the message chose a healthier snack. So, even with education, people say, well, we just need to have more education. It's probably not targeted enough. So only the people who are already on board with dieting or healthy eating are going to respond to this kind of messaging. So that presents another challenge. Other voices, surely there's a plan B, and we all know what the plan B is, that boring moderation of a healthy diet. But interesting, this guy, Anthony Warner, so he's a chef in the UK. And I recommend you get onto his website because I really like him. He's the Angry Chef, exposing lies, pretensions and stupidity in the world of food. He says, there are some outliers who will claim that all conventional dietary advice is wrong. But if you look at most governments, health charities and organisations, they will tell you the same thing. Eat a balanced diet, not too much, fruit and veg, plenty of complex carbs, try and swap saturated fats for polys and get variety. Personally, I like to trust the consensus view of respected organisations that take their time to look at all the evidence, not just cherry-pick studies that suit an agenda. And if you go onto his website, his blog and his articles are quite lengthy, but he talks about processed food, what is and what isn't. He talks about allergens and free from. He has a real bee in his bonnet. He's an interesting guy, 25 years as a chef. He also has a degree in biochemistry. And he takes a fantastic view. So he's getting to be quite popular and getting a bit more of a voice. And of course, we see last month, Belle Gibson, she's down in court there in Victoria, and she has been found by a federal court judge to have deliberately played the Australian public, and sadly has been caught spruiking another fat diet and bragging about intestinal worms. So she kind of hasn't stopped. So we're seeing things come undone, and I think 2 years ago in Marie Claire, she was like won some Marie Claire magazine award for top 5 women entrepreneurs for her healthy eating pantry website. And then there's this other piece, Rowan Anderson, and there's a lot more articulated about wellness gurus and how they're forming part of the problem, and anxiety. So Rowan Anderson wrote this really good piece just last month about feeding anxiety. We want to be healthy, we get lost along the way and get inspired in different ways. This sounds, again, without labouring the point, it sounds like religion. We get lost along the way and we want to get inspired by lots of different things in terms of human belonging, and diet is absolutely one of them. Why do we have such an array of books, all with their own unique 8-week program? Why do we have so many people giving expert culinary health recommendations when they're not experts? To the novice reader, it's easy to believe everything you read. This can be a dangerous thing. Fake cancer survival wellness guru ringing any bells. Okay? It's in mainstream. And then, of course, Sarah Berry did a nice piece about this. And, dietitians are not using the word diet anymore. Diet for how it is typically meant to be taken in terms of weight loss. And Joe McMillan, has talked about a program, a happy, healthier body for life, nutrition and lifestyle specialist. And we all know about Joanna and how robust and her common sense approach. So there's enough out there now that's kind of saying diet's probably not a great idea. There's other ways of doing it. So in conclusion, all right, so the obesity system map. This is a really hard problem to solve. So I've been, done a talk on fad diet. It's very difficult to sit here at the conclusion of my talk and think, well, what's going to solve the problem? Well, it is a multi-layered, many-stakeholdered situation. There are many qualified people, highly educated, qualified people who have different views, opposing views on the things that need to be put in place to reduce obesity. And I think I haven't got the data today, but I've certainly shown in other talks that human mass, or our BMIs, or our weight, has risen steadily over the last 300 years. These are all the elements in play in a system. So the point of this chart is to say it's really complicated and not something that one person or one thing can solve. I think most people would agree with that who have a balanced view. And, Joe Public, it's pretty bloody tough. It's bloody tough for Joe Public because there are so many promises. There is so much conflicting advice. Even, dietetics as a science, well, because it's a science, then there's constantly research. There are new things that are being found every year, every 5 years. evidence from studies that suggest, well, maybe we should be doing maybe a bit less of this and a bit more of that. And that just makes people throw their hands up and go in the air and go, well, then how is it different from any other diet that comes along? So it's hard. And I always think to myself, there's got to be a voice of science when we talk with wellness gurus. And there was an interesting piece written, it's a little bit old now, it's from 2016, but bring science to wellness. And the message is being there. You know, having our scientists alongside our wellness gurus. And Joe McMillan, I think, does a very nice job of that, because whenever there's something in the paper about a wellness piece or layest guru, luckily Sarah Berry and other journalists often ask for her opinion or others. But I think, you know, there's another step. You know, maybe try and stand next to them a little bit more, scientific experts, and at least offer an alternate view. You know, it's far better that a scientific expert is quoted in an article about gut health along the latest celebrity food medicine advocate to have than to have no evidence-based information available to a reader at all. So trying to find a way of being there. All right. So what are the things that are going to make a difference? I've showed that multi-layered, very complex schematic. But I think, you know, from the research, the work, talking to consumers over a long period of time and thinking about this whole system, there's got to be some fundamental things that can come through messaging, can come through new products, can come through branding that show there are ways that you can make changes to improve your life that don't involve alienating your family and friends, breaking the bank, or being sad and unhappy and obsessed with food and pretty much giving up your life. So, you know, health measures other than mass or BMI, and there was a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald just the other week about BMI being thrown into question. I think a bodybuilder or a personal trainer, according to BMI, he was morbidly obese, but, you know, he was actually quite ripped. So, you know, it kind of raised that question. So there are other health measures. You know, there's kilograms, but there's blood pressure and there's blood sugar and there's your cholesterol. But quite apart from that, there's mind measures as well. So in terms of body image and confidence and even other body measures like flexibility and strength, for example. So there are many ways that you can demonstrate health quite apart from kilograms. Education and trust, and I think that's very much linked to trust in the scientific process. And a lot of people say, oh, obesity, it's education. Well, it is. I think it's probably the very first step of 100,000 in terms of this, and it needs to obviously be a constant message. But as we've seen before, I don't think necessarily the education and messaging has been properly targeted to the right segments, because, you know, we know there's evidence to suggest that only people who are open to it are even going to listen to it. And they're maybe or maybe not already down the path. Are they down the right path? I'm not sure, but at least their mind is open in terms of behaviour change to be looking to that. But there's also the trust in the scientific process, and that's a bigger issue for the whole of the scientific community globally to address. I think positive supports and incentives is really important. The good things that can happen, you know, the goals that you can achieve independently of the number on the scale. So you'll be able to walk for 2 kilometres, or, you know, you'll be able to swim with your children for half an hour, or whatever it is that is going to be personally motivating in that way. And good supports. I often think that being overweight or attacks on people with weight issues is probably the last acceptable bastion of bigotry. There's all sorts of interesting studies about how people with who carry excess weight are perceived. So, for example, they're not as trustworthy. There's a perception that they're more likely to tell you something that was a falsehood. They're more likely to lie. They're more likely to steal something from you. More likely to have a lower IQ is another general perception around people who carry a bit of weight. So, you know, there's lots of issues around that. That is also another talk, I think, social issues around weight. Anyway, so quick wins for encouragement. I mean, we've talked about fads, and one of the things that's good about that is, you know, you do get a good response. It might not be the right response, but you see things happening. And I think, you know, is there any way that programs or food types or any kinds of approaches can show some quick wins for encouragement is really good. And that's for people trying anything new any of the time. The little kids trying tennis, you know, make it positive, show that they can do at least something so that they'll keep going. And that might mean, you know, your cholesterol comes down by half a point. You know, you can see some movement. Seeing movement is really important. Psychologically. So the psychology is really important. So strategies for pushing past mental barriers. And the mind-body connection, I don't think, can ever be underestimated. I think there's enough evidence. The Minnesota starvation experiment is a really good one. But all of those issues around the mind-body relationship with food absolutely needs to be taken up in terms of weight loss and health management. Strategies for pushing past a lot of the mental barriers. So particularly for people who've tried, honestly, every diet, have probably lost and gained 50 kilos in their lives, probably need to reduce their weight a bit for health reasons, but quite frankly can't face it because of the history, all the stuff that's happened to them in terms of food and diet. They're just not ready for it. Yet maybe losing 5 kilos will save their life. So I think that's another very important approach. And also the whole "this is for life." And Jonah McMillan always, I'm not being paid by her, by the way, to do this talk, but, you know, it is for life. And she says, this is for life, guys. I know it's hard to grasp, but this is what you need to start doing to improve your life and perhaps even save it. And that's my talk. Thank you very much.